Alberta taking more bold steps on the path to addiction recovery. Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist with the Toronto Sun. Over the last several years, we have had debates over the best way to help those suffering, dealing with addictions, move forward. For years, the answer was always, well, greater access to drugs. We experimented with decriminalization of all drugs in British Columbia. That went horribly. We had safe injection sites popping up across the country. Results were not that good. We also had so-called safe supply. This was the idea that handing out hydromorphone pills, opioid pills to people to deal with their addiction was the way to get them to eventually come to terms with kicking the habit. As it turns out, what we did was put, well, activists in charge of the system, activists who didn't believe that what we needed to do was help anyone get off drugs. In fact, they discouraged addiction treatment and recovery. They discouraged the idea that people should stop using drugs and instead pushed the idea that this was just another lifestyle choice. Several years ago, Alberta decided to take a different path. They focused on addiction and treatment, recovery, you might call it. And it's working. Now they're taking another step, bringing in an act that they hope will lead to more people getting treatment, those who are the hardest to reach, people who are causing harm to themselves. The Compassionate Intervention Act is being introduced in Alberta to allow family members, guardians, treatment specialists, police officers, and others to recommend people to have a court-ordered treatment plan put in place. Dan Williams is the minister in charge of mental health and addictions, and he joins me now to talk about this. Minister, I know the legislation has not passed. I know that it's just been introduced. You've got all the caveats of if passed, all of that. But what's the intention of this legislation? What is the hope behind it, the reason behind it?
Well, the idea is recovery. The idea is a culture of life affirming healthcare that heals and doesn't harm. Look, Brian, Canadians, Albertans as well, we've been lied to for the last 25 years, 30 years when it comes to addiction policy within our country. And it's governments like the Trudeau Liberals and the Carney Liberals now that have been pushing this sort of double talk. The fact is that we've been given this false dichotomy. We've been told you either have to be compassionate to those in addiction or we have to have communities, or you have to let your community self-destruct, right? And it's not true. You can care for those from addiction, and for a small group of Albertans, those who every other opportunity has been trialed, when addiction or the substance use is causing harm to themselves or others in a really big and substantial way, then we as a society have an obligation to intervene compassionately, not in a law enforcement mechanism. I'm not a minister of justice, I'm a minister of healthcare. In a healthcare that heals people and doesn't harm them. Because what the left has been trying for the last 25 years on this country, when it comes to addiction, has been crazy. They want drug injection sites in every street corner and unsafe supplies to our families. That is only facilitating more addiction. The object here, what we're trying to do, is compassionately, in a healthcare setting, as a society, intervene and get people the opportunity at recovery, because recovery is not only possible, but it's probable when a government builds those pathways. So for that small group of Albertans that are a danger to themselves or others, we're going to be having this compassionate intervention with potentially mandatory treatment as a part of the outcome.
You talked about the government being part of this, and I remember a little while ago there was a lawsuit against Purdue Pharmaceutical and other manufacturers of opioids. And I thought, oh, okay, good. This is for the opioid addiction crisis that we had a few years ago. And then suddenly they turn around and they become the government at various levels, including the federal government with Safe Supply, becomes the biggest buyer of these same opioid pills to try and say, now this is how you solve the problem. The government went from suing a company saying you were pushing drugs to saying, okay, we're going to buy them off you and push them on people now. That never made sense to me. And I'm guessing it didn't make sense to you in terms of a policy, because you have not jumped in on Safe Supply, have you?
No, and I have to correct you on one thing because that was a bang-on statement, but they're not the same pills. These pills, hydromorphone, are 5 times more powerful than heroin, more than 2.5 times
Wow.
more powerful than the previous oxycodone pills that caused this crisis in the late 90s and early 2000s. But you're exactly right. Unsafe supply is illegal in the province of Alberta by our legislation. The province is responsible for healthcare, not the federal government, and they're bigfooting in and somehow have found a way with a dumpster fire that was created by the pharmaceutical industry when it came to the public addiction crisis that we see in the streets. The federal Liberal government found a way to pour jet fuel onto that by supplying the drug itself. The axiomatic rule that came out of the Stanford Lancet Commission, which is the preeminent authority that Stanford and the publication Lancet did together on the North American opioid crisis, is that if you increase supply of a substance without obstacles, you will increase the harm. So if you increase the supply of high-powered opioids 5 times more powerful than heroin, then you will increase the harm to society. And it stops being about what they call harm reduction, and it becomes harm production. They end up producing the very harm they claim to try and mitigate by supplying high-powered opioids. By contrast, Alberta and the Alberta recovery model is saying something categorically different. We're saying that instead of having a healthcare system that facilitates and continues to harm people with addiction, let's get people healthcare that heals them. Let's get them recovery. And the Compassionate Intervention Act is a small part of that continuum. We have added 10,000 beds since 2019. The budget has grown from $50 million when we created our ministry in 2019 into somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.8 billion. And it's going towards common sense policies like this one that build out capacity for recovery, that get people who are in addiction, make sure we understand and respect the dignity that they have as individuals and brings them into recovery. But it also says community has a right to be safe. Community has a right to say, I'm not going to inhale secondhand crystal meth smoke. And I'm not going to have to deal with my wife and daughter going to the swimming lesson at the local Rexplex, walking in front of somebody who's having a schizophrenic break, who's speedballing methamphetamine and fentanyl, who's fencing with the wind with a used syringe, who needs health care, not a facilitated government that says, do more of this, it's going to get better. That's nuts. Alberta has rejected that and said common sense policies instead.
Look, I live in downtown Toronto. I see this all the time. And when I speak to relatives in smaller localities, they often think, well, this is just a big city problem. Now, I've looked at the numbers. Ontario, BC, and Alberta have been hit hardest with the opioid crisis, far more than any other province. And Alberta was hit especially hard. And when I remember looking at your numbers before you turned to this new Alberta model, looking at the numbers and seeing where on a per capita basis it was, people are afraid of big cities like Toronto, like Vancouver, like Montreal, or Calgary. But where was it hitting in Alberta? It was hitting in Lethbridge. It was hitting in Red Deer. It was hitting in smaller communities as well. Small to medium-sized communities were among the hardest hit. I think Lethbridge, on a per capita basis, at the height, was among the worst in the country. How are things turning around with what you've tried so far? And then I'll ask you more about the steps you're taking now with the involuntary care.
Yeah, Alberta's had some good progress and a reduction of overdose deaths from opioids. Now, we're cautious. We want to see more. We know more work has to happen. But you can see we have a 39% decrease year over year of opioid overdose deaths. That is the most recent data that we have, and it's an incredible outcome. That is a 3-time greater reduction than they've seen in British Columbia. British Columbia has not, for the record, adopted the Alberta recovery model. They have the British Columbia harm production model, for lack of a better phrase, where they tried making it decriminalizing all hard drugs. You saw nurses and others saying that they had to deal with crystal meth smoke in the hospitals as there was no recourse. You had unsafe supply, distributed mass, $100 million worth of federal Liberal SUAP grants going across the country to places like British Columbia and, unfortunately, places in Ontario where they trialed this insane idea that if you provide high-powered opioids to those suffering from opioid addiction, it will somehow make the problem better. The British Columbia government has gone all in on the drug consumption sites. They have more drug consumption sites than the rest of Canada combined. They have close to half the world's supply of drug consumption sites in their jurisdiction. This is an idea that the rest of the world has seen of decriminalization, of unsafe supply, of drug consumption sites everywhere, and they've turned the other cheek. They said, no, thank you. I don't want to go down this road. Alberta's path has taken a different path. It's compassionate, it cares for the dignity of the individual, And we cautiously are very optimistic. We've seen 3 times greater reduction in opioid deaths in Alberta with an integrated drug market between the 2 provinces, similar populations and demographics, and Alberta seems to be taking a different policy tack that leads to, who knew it, Brian, if you don't facilitate addiction, different outcomes, better outcomes,
Yep.
healthier outcomes for Albertans.
Hearing constantly about, oh, we should be like Portugal and just legalize everything. Everyone forgets the next step, which is Portugal does have drug treatment, and it court-ordered drug treatment at that. Now, what you're talking about with what you call compassionate intervention is people who are going to cause harm to themselves, which I could legitimately argue is everyone who's addicted to these substances. But you're saying some people will be put into what others would describe as involuntary care.
Yeah.
How do you do that? What are the parameters? How do you do this within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which some judges will say, no, that person has the complete right to continue to kill themselves, cause themselves harm, and harm those around them?
Yeah. So, first of all, what this act isn't about is most people who use drugs, most people who are in addiction. I care about anyone in addiction. That's my job as the minister responsible in the province, and I've invested and built out thousands upon thousands of spaces with millions upon tens of millions of dollars of operating funds to care for them. This is for a small group of people that have significant harm that's likely to happen within a reasonable amount of time to themselves or others due to their substance use or addiction. Now that's the standard and the test that's going to be used. And it also is paralleling what we see in Mental Health Act in Alberta and across every province and territory in the country. If somebody's going to cause harm to themselves or someone else due to their diagnosed mental illness, then we have recourse to get them help, to get them the ability to become healthy again and into recovery. Because addiction is not listed as one of those diagnosed illnesses, this is not available to most people who suffer from addiction and to communities that suffer the negative consequences of public addiction on their streets and in their homes. And so
It's very much a public, there is a public part of this where the rest of us suffer because of someone else's addiction. In my
that's
neighborhood, it's horrible.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And it's this lie that we've been told is that for you to be compassionate, you have to allow this public chaos to continue. And that's a lie. It's a false dichotomy. The truth is, for you to be compassionate, not only should you not allow the public chaos to happen, the public addiction to unfold, and all of its grotesque carnage that happens to somebody as they go through this state of addiction without appropriate health care, it's also not good for that individual. It's unhumane, and it's not humanizing, it's not dignified, it's not respecting the inherent dignity of every individual to just say that's their choice, I'm going to let them self-destruct through addiction. I mean, we're talking about cerebral hypoxia. When someone overdoses, Brian, it means that your lungs stop taking the oxygen in, your respiration goes all the way down to the point where no more blood is going to your brain. So it's the equivalent of somebody suffocating or maybe drowning underwater, but instead of it happening somewhere distant, it's in downtown Toronto or downtown Calgary with thousands of citizens around. This is not compassionate. They don't have, as individual citizens, this toolkits that they need as a healthcare response to care for that person in addiction. But as society, we do. As the Minister of the Crown responsible for addiction, I have the ability to help and to intervene for those who have no other option. We had one individual, Brian, who overdosed 186 times last year. This is not a lifestyle choice. And to those justices that say that this is somehow unconstitutional, I don't know a single one of them that would say if it was my son or my daughter, there's some constitutional fairy tale idea that you need to overdose 187th time and die because the Constitution says so. It doesn't work that way.
Or even, Minister, I'm sure you've seen people just sitting on a sidewalk in the street, caring for their wounds, their open, gaping wounds that they've got that are a result of the addiction and the lifestyle that comes with it. That is not compassionate. I walk by these people and it's heartbreaking. Do you need to use the notwithstanding clause, though, in order to get this through, or will you wait and see what the courts say? How are you going to handle that? Because you know there will be people who will challenge this and say, no, it is that man's charter right to overdose 187th time or however many times it takes until he dies.
I think I think to answer that, you have to understand what addiction is. And the facts matter, whatever the court might think with its idea of a living tree and they get to reinvent policies they like. Addiction, the anthropology of human nature, addiction ends in only one of two ways. It either ends in pain and misery and given enough time and enough carnage, death to that individual, or it ends in treatment and recovery and a second lease on life. And when the clock runs out, I want to have as many Albertans and Canadians living fully returned as brothers and mothers and community members again. And the idea that there's a constitutional argument against getting those people recovery and protecting them from this destructive disease of addiction that is deadly and takes lives at this incredible rate, I think is crazy, to be honest. If in the end, we have drafted legislation that is constitutional. That's my obligation as a minister. It's our job as a government to make sure that we make sure our legislation is constitutional. But if a court, an activist court, has a different opinion than this government, there are mechanisms within the Charter to resolve that. So we'll see exactly what happens. But I can tell you the opinion of this government is resolute, and that we believe we should be caring for people who suffer from addiction, and we should be helping them get health care, not facilitating their harm.
All right, Minister Williams, thanks so much. We will follow this legislation as it goes through the legislature and ultimately and unfortunately the courts as well. Thanks again.
Right. Thank you.
All right, let us know what you think. Drop a comment down below, share this on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.